several of the protest leaders have said to me that, look, the genie is out of the bottle. Even if you put this down by force now, it's going to come back later. And it's really got to a situation where I think people in Belarus are looking at him and thinking, this doesn't represent us, this doesn't represent our country, this is something from another age. So Alexander Lukashenko has been the president of Belarus for 26 years, and this August he was expecting to get another 5 years. It became clear that this time he was going to be facing some serious opposition, and he dealt with that in his usual way. He jailed 2 of the candidates who were planning to stand against him. A third one went into exile. But he made a bit of a mistake. He allowed onto the ballot the wife of one of those jailed candidates, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, because he clearly thought it would lend him some legitimacy. And as he said, women don't have any place in politics. Her one promise was that she'd get into office, she'd call new free and fair elections, and she'd be a sort of interim transition leader.
I can't lead all my people behind me because I'm more frightened than anybody else. I'm like a symbol. They are shouting for their future, for their wish to live in a free country.
So this got a lot of people excited and by extension made them very angry when on election night Lukashenko's election commission announced that he'd won with 80% of the vote and she had got just 10%. So that evening, on Sunday the 9th of August, thousands of people came out into the streets of Minsk to protest what they saw, and I think what most people agreed was a pretty seriously rigged election. And they were met with really ruthless violence.
5 days of protests and brutal crackdowns has left Belarus in turmoil.
Protesters shouting at police to go away, and then scenes of violence reflected across Belarus's capital.
Over those first 3 days of protests, there were around 7,000 people detained. Probably a majority of those, certainly a majority of the men, were sort of ritually beaten, abused, humiliated. In some cases, I think we can call it torture. It was that bad. And instead of cowing the population, this had the opposite effect. To the point that on the Sunday, so 1 week after that election victory, Minsk saw the biggest protest in the country's recent history.
Хотим перемен, даже не с точки зрения политики, а с точки зрения того, что мы хотим, чтобы человеческая жизнь была ценной.
So Lukashenko's regime, although it was repressive, it was old-fashioned, and it was very unpleasant in many ways, it wasn't totalitarian. So if you didn't get active in politics, you could almost forget that that was the country you lived in. But I think in recent years, like every autocrat, he's began to lose touch with reality more and more. He's surrounded by sycophants. And a phrase I heard again and again over the last few weeks was people saying that they always knew what country they lived in. They never particularly liked it, but they thought they could ignore it. And they realized when they saw this violence that they couldn't ignore it anymore. Those first 2 Sundays of protest after the elections, standing in these enormous crowds in the center of Minsk, you really felt Lukashenko has to be finished. How can a leader with this little legitimacy among his own people cling on to power? But it became clear that he has kept the support of the riot police, he's kept the support so far of the army and his core ministers. And so now, clearly, his goal is to gently draw the life out of the protest movement by arresting its leaders and hoping that they lose steam. But at the same time, we don't see yet at least, any kind of desire on the part of protesters to start storming buildings or taking down the regime by force. Several of the protest leaders have said to me that, look, you know, the genie is out of the bottle. Maybe it's going to take some time, but sooner or later, the people will win. So there's this kind of sense of at least long-term optimism despite all of the short-term obstacles.